All right, thanks, guys. My name is Jori Ramakers, and I'm the Director of Strategy within Tricentis. Also, I'm one of the founders of the X Framework, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next half an hour, basically. So, the X Framework, as you have seen maybe in Christian's presentation earlier today already, is an accelerated continuous testing framework for enterprise organizations. What we're trying to achieve with the Act framework is basically build a community-driven framework for testing, how to set up testing in enterprise organizations. So if you think about scaled agile framework, if you scaled agile frameworks, the less framework, or even the Spotify model, all these models talk about how you set up agile and DevOps in enterprise organizations, how you speed up software development. But what these frameworks typically lack, or they do talk about it, but not enough, is testing. How do you set up testing in those enterprise organizations? And that's basically the gap that the ACT framework is filling. So that's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to take you on a deep dive on the ACT framework model, what that actually means, what kind of rules, processes, capabilities, responsibilities, and metrics you need to set up to be successful for continuous testing in enterprises. This is actually the first time that we present this on the big stage. So thank you so much, Tricentis, for hosting us on stage. And we started with this basically 2 months ago. We started with developing the model. So we've had a lot of implementations over the past years, and every single time we were working in an enterprise, we saw that they were all dealing with the same problems and the same issues. And at some point, Tricentis, but also a couple of other partners came together with some early adopter customers, and we were like, okay, we really need to do something with this. We really need to make sure that we come up with something where we can educate the market and where we can educate those organizations to have something out there that can really help them overcome these challenges. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So before I'm even I'm going into the model, let's have a look at quickly at industry trends. So initially, whenever I was designing these slides 2 weeks ago, I was like, okay, so how am I introducing the problem statement? Or like, what is the problem? And I guess most of you are familiar with that. But then whenever I started to design the slides, I got an email from Capgemini SOHT where they said, hey, the new World Quality Report just has been released. And while I was reading the executive summary, in the executive summary, they were talking about, okay, so while the lines are blurring between development and QA, there are still silos because we have a lack of a methodology which is being implemented. Their QA is focused on the team level, but there is still a need for full lifecycle testing. And even from a technology perspective, we have exploratory testing, we have automation in place, but the maintenance is a big problem there, so there is a need for self-heal. Then, when I continued reading, and I was looking at the first graph in that report, that actually perfectly explained what we are trying to solve with the X framework. So whenever you look at that graph, basically, if you would summarize what the problems are, or the biggest problems for organizations to adopt testing in an agile enterprise environment is typically test data, it's environments, it's the test automation, it's the skill set of the people or the coverage that we're dealing with, or even the methodical approach for testing and how to set it up. And then with all of that, also the resilience and the reusability of the testing artifacts. Well, so the report, the executive summary finalized the report with this statement. I'm going to read that quickly. So it says, we recommend a change of thinking about test automation. Organizations should regard it less as a capability and more as a platform. It should be seen as a broad arena of tools and functions that come together to fulfill a collective approach, working intelligently end-to-end and driven by the objectives of the business. This was specifically about test automation. Now, if we throw that away and we replace test automation with testing, and we're not talking about tools and functions, but we're talking about people, processes, and technologies, that's actually the perfect description of what the ACT framework is. And this is how it looks like. So the ACT framework basically defines what kind of roles you need in your enterprise organization. It defines it on a team level, on a program level and on the enterprise level. It defines what capabilities you need to implement. It defines how you need to deal with test data management, with service virtualization, how you deal with your budgeting, for example, how you deal with tool integrations, and how you build an operating model so you can actually scale it across the enterprise. And all of that is built on a foundation. Now, this model, that's exactly what we're now going to talk about. So we start with the middle piece, the centerpiece, the feedback loop. And the feedback loop basically provides prompt and accurate feedback to the development teams. And the feedback loop, probably you know a lot of these terminologies already, basically talks about the different levels of testing we need to do to make sure that our applications are functioning correctly. Obviously, beginning with unit testing. So unit testing is really the practice of testing the code and testing the functions in the application. It's measured by the code coverage, of course, and the feedback should be provided every check-in, and it should be provided in seconds, right? We don't want to slow down the development, or we don't want to make sure that developers are not checking in their code because the unit tests run too long. Then the next level of testing, which also happens on the team level, is the system testing. And for system testing, you're basically testing your application in isolation to verify if your API are functioning according to your contracts, so how the API should be structured, as well as the isolated UI of the application you want to verify before you're going to put it in a QA environment where you're going to do the first integration testing. But the integration testing happens on the program level. You're going to connect the first systems together, where you will run UI and API application tests, and after every deployment to QA, you want to make sure that those test cases are executed. At this moment in time, you're also going to switch your metrics from code coverage to basically risk coverage, a currency we call risk coverage. So that basically means you have your requirements linked to your test cases, and if you weigh your requirements relatively to each other, it will give you an idea of risk. So whenever I execute my test cases right now and a test case is failing, instead of saying we executed 1,000 test cases, one failed, what does that mean? Can we go live or not? With risk coverage, you can actually, because you linked it to the business risk, you can actually say something useful about it. It was either a very major function in our application and we can't go live, or maybe it was something very minor. So it makes the decision-making process easier. On the enterprise level, that's where we get to the end-to-end testing. So we deploy to the acceptance environment at this point in time. And now the purpose of the end-to-end testing is basically trying to touch as many interfaces as possible to figure out if the applications are behaving correctly towards each other. We have already tested the individual applications because we have done the unit and system testing, we have done the system integration testing. So if you find any defects here, it's typically within the integration of these applications. So every time we have a deployment to the acceptance environment, the first feedback should come in minutes, but it obviously is being extended and depending on how thorough you want to do your testing. And then at the last step, you want to do your user acceptance testing, which is still a manual process where you're really doing the business process verification to make sure that whatever we provide from a software delivery perspective, if that's aligned with the business. So the business is really doing that. And then when we deploy to production, we want to make sure we do technical and functional verification tests after every deployment to production. Now, where does continuous delivery, where does continuous deployment fit in? So CI fits on the team level on unit and system testing. So your unit and system testing should be part of your CI. Continuous delivery includes basically the full development, the full deployment process and testing process all the way to your staging environment. So not deployment to production, that's still a manual step, but all the steps before should be part of your continuous delivery. And if you're talking about continuous deployment, that's basically the full thing, except in this specific case of the continuous deployment, you want to have all of these steps automated, which means that your user acceptance testing will be separate. It's not part of your continuous deployment pipeline. All right. So then, that's the first thing. So that's the feedback loop. Then we talk about the organizational structure. And when we talk about the organizational structure, we have defined 3 different levels. We defined the team level, where we talk about specific team roles, where the teams are focusing, as you can see in the picture, on unit and system testing and on the continuous integration of their specific application. Then on the program level, we are talking about the system integration testing. And on the enterprise level, we're talking about the end-to-end testing, the user acceptance and production testing. What are those roles? So let's envision we have a couple of feature teams. And these feature teams, some of these feature teams are working on an Angular web application, and the other one is working on a middleware like TIBCO or whatever. In each of these teams, we define a couple of roles we need for our software development and our testing. So obviously, we will have our development, we will have our ops, we will have a product owner, and of course, they will be supported by a Scrum Master to make sure all the tickets are being handled correctly. But we added two specific roles here. We added a test analyst and we added an automation specialist. The test analyst is really the person, the product SME or the process SME. He knows everything about testing. He uses a methodical approach to setting up the tests and making sure that we have enough coverage and we're covering all the different functionalities that are being added to the application. While the automation specialist is the person that will work with basically test automation to automate some of those test cases. So while the test analyst is mostly focusing on progression testing, the automation specialist is thinking about, okay, so what of the tests that we're doing in our progression testing should be added to our regression tests? What should we add to our CI pipeline? What should we run after every deployment to QA? And what should we run after every deployment to the acceptance environment? And each of these teams basically are consisting out of those guys. Now, while those teams are working on unit and system testing, the next step is something which we call a systems team. But before I go into that, these guys are supported are supported by the test architect and the automation engineer. So while these teams are all still in the same program, they're still working on the same program, maybe on different applications or in different areas of the applications. If you do not have a test architect or an automation engineer on the program level, you will get a wild growth of things that the teams are developing. If the teams are fully autonomous themselves, then those initial teams will be successful. But when you're going to scale it, how do you make sure that every team is as mature, that every team is collaborating with each other, so that artifacts are actually reused, that we're not creating redundancy across the teams, and if there are any technical issues, who is going to solve that? And that's basically where the test architect and the automation engineer are coming in. So the program test architect is basically responsible for continuous testing at the program level. So he will work as a coach to help the teams on collaboration. He will work on coaching the test analysts and the automation specialists and doing the work properly, making sure that they are reusing each other's artifacts, that they are learning from each other. So knowledge sharing is also a very important asset there. And the automation engineer is really helping all of these guys to make sure that all the technical solutions they are using, that they can use that properly and that's used in the right way, basically. Now, with that, the program test architect and the program automation engineer, together with what we call a systems team. So a systems team is basically a team that goes across those individual applications teams. They together form a system team which is responsible for the system integration testing. So the idea here is that the artifacts that we have created in each of these individual teams, so the models that we have created and the test artifacts that we have created, that we're reusing those models to define our system integration tests. Yeah? So in that way, we are not redefining and creating new automation and creating new tests in our system integration tests, but we're actually reusing what we have already built, which means that we reduce our redundancy and we maximize our reusability. As we're talking about enterprises, so on a team level, you're talking about working on a certain application or an application area. On the program level, we might be thinking about linking a couple of applications together, but in most enterprises, we have multiple lines of businesses. And if we're talking about end-to-end testing, we have a vast landscape of sometimes even 50, 100, 200 applications that all needs to be linked together. So on the enterprise level, we also need to have a solution for our end-to-end testing. So basically, the concept we just showed for the program level, we want to do that as well on the enterprise level, where we have a system team, where we have a representative of each of the programs that come together, led by an enterprise test architect and an enterprise automation engineer, that work together to basically define those end-to-end test cases and make sure that they are executing, that we're reusing those artifacts, and that all works together properly. Okay, so that's basically the structure on the team level. Then if we look at the capabilities, what kind of capabilities do we are we looking at? Because if we talk about continuous testing, there are a lot of things we need to think about. We need to have capabilities that contribute to a lean, resilient, and scalable testing process, right? So if we go back to those roles, what we were talking about, the test architect and so the program test architect and the enterprise test architect, together with the test analyst, they will work on the testing strategy and they will work on the test planning. So we'll need to make sure that we are implementing a risk-based testing approach. So we can't test, I mean, obviously we can't test everything, so we need to make sure that we have a methodical approach behind what we're actually testing. And also how we're designing those tests, right? So we want to make sure that we generate that in the most optimal way possible. And that's basically what these guys are working on. On the other hand, we need to have a clear execution strategy on what test cases are we executing when in our software development pipeline. And we also want to think about what is the test distribution. So what are we testing in our unit and system tests? What are we testing in our system integration tests? And what are we testing in our end-to-end tests? To give an example, I was at a bank in Australia a while ago. It was back in May. And these guys basically went full-scaled agile. Their teams were autonomous, and they basically had a perfect setup for their unit and system testing, and all these teams had a proper risk-based testing approach. The only thing what they did is, because they went full autonomous, they basically got rid of that middle layer of for the system integration testing and the end-to-end testing. So now each of the individual applications was responsible for testing their integrations as well, which caused that the SAP platform was running certain tests through another system, but then on the other hand, that other system was running tests through SAP with exactly the same coverage. There was a lot of redundancy because there was no collaboration and talking against each other, and that's something we need to solve. That's something we need to look into. Then, if we talk about the test analyst and the automation specialist, they will be focusing on exploratory testing and test automation from a progression and regression testing perspective. And the automation engineer, together with the automation specialist, will focus on test data strategy, environment strategy, making sure that we can generate our test data, whether that's by using synthetic test data or we're copying back production copies. We need to come up with a strategy where we can implement that in our continuous testing pipeline, because it needs to be predictable and it needs to be reusable, right? So that's where these guys work on. And at the end of the day, the test analyst, the automation specialist, and the automation engineer together are working on a model which we call ASSESS, which is basically a root cause analysis methodology, where ASSESS stands for analyze, stop and solve, extract, and show and share. And what that means is basically every time we have a false positive in our automation, we want to make sure that we analyze what's going on there. And whenever we found the root cause, we don't only just want to solve it, but we also want to stop it. We want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. And we want to extract the information, what we learned from that, because maybe we're making agreements with our developers, maybe we're implementing like certain recovery scenarios, or we're writing scripts to load test data, because if it was a test data problem. But you don't only want to solve it, you also want to share it. So other teams will actually learn from that. So it's not only one team that at the end is maturing, but you want to make sure that your entire organization learns from that and matures. So you need to make sure that you show and share that as well. So those are some of the capabilities where what we talk about in the ACT framework. From a visibility perspective, we more talk about, okay, how do we make sure that we actually know what we're doing? You want to create a transparent organization with end-to-end visibility. And what that means is basically you want to have certain metrics and KPIs that you're tracking on the team level, but also that you're then tracking on the program and enterprise level. You want to make success stories. So whenever you're starting to implement this whole thing, you need to create success stories to create further buy-in and to reduce resistance from teams that haven't transitioned yet. So you want to start with individual teams, set up the CI process for them and make sure that they are successful, create a success story out of that, and share that with the rest of the organization as well to make sure that they see the value and they actually want to transform their testing. And from a metrics perspective, you want to make sure that those individual teams, they need to have their own dashboards. You want to make sure that you're tracking your test activity distribution. So how much time are we spending on on test design, on test planning, on how much wait time do we have that we're actually waiting because our test environments are down or we don't have test data available. How much time are we spending on test analysis or on test execution? Those are all things you want to track, because if you track those over time, and you also track, for example, how many defects we find, over time, you can spot in the trends. So you can spot certain trends, and based on that, you can learn. So you can adopt that continuous learning capability in your teams, which means that you can make your teams better and better and better. On the other hand, it also creates exposure because people see what you're doing and people see how you're improving, which also helps with basically selling and marketing internally to further scale that. So if you have your individual teams, then on the program level and on the enterprise level, you want to combine those metrics as well. So you basically create that end-to-end visibility across the enterprise where it's visible for everyone what is actually going on. Now, all of that is basically built on a foundation and a certain mindset. So the foundation, which is basically the bottom part of the model, really talks about, okay, what is the basics of continuous testing? So what is continuous testing, first of all? It talks about what are the values, so what is the mindset that people need to have in the organization to be successful in testing? You need to define a vision on what you want to achieve as a company. What are the business outcomes you're trying to achieve, and how does that drill down into how we set up our teams and how we set up our programs to actually achieve that vision, right? And with that, and if you have that vision, you actually need to have a roadmap available on how you transform your organization or your testing organization to be able to do that, right? So what are the steps we need to go through? From a resource perspective, if you're working with service integrators, how does that fit in, right? So you can have like internal resources, but maybe you're also working with partners and you're outsourcing certain things. How do you deal with that? And at the end, what is the checklist to success? What do we all need to implement to be successful? That's basically what we describe in the foundation. So from a core values perspective, and I know these are open doors, but it's always good to reiterate, testing is everyone's responsibility. Yeah? So it's not only the QA personnel that needs to work on that, it's basically the entire team, and it's the entire organization that needs to work on that. So the collaboration part is super important. Quality first. So you want to make sure that you think about the testability of your application before you're even going to develop, right? That's where the test-driven development and the behavior-driven development methodologies come from. You want to collaborate with each other to reduce redundancy, to have reusability of your artifacts. And you want to embrace failure. This is a really important one. Failure is perfect because you learn from that. You learn, and that's the whole purpose of this thing. You want to make sure that while you're learning, especially in the beginning, while you're learning what works and what doesn't, how to solve it, and you can make an operating model out of that. The thing you want to make sure is that when you're learning that you're sharing that. And therefore you need to embrace failure, because if you don't fail, you will never improve. So what is the roadmap? How would a typical implementation roadmap look like of the ACT framework? We typically define 4 phases, which we call innovate, promote, scale, and optimize. So if we are going to transform our testing organization within the enterprise, we start with the innovate phase. So we select a couple of teams that have a big, hairy problem. For example, they can't keep up with their development speed, or they have a high visibility in the organization, and we're going to make those individual teams successful on the continuous integration level. Yeah? So when they are successful, we are going to measure certain metrics. we're going to set up a success story or a case study for those individual teams, and that we're going to promote to our executive management and to our senior management to show what outcomes we have achieved and what they could achieve if they would further scale that into the organization. In the scale phase, this is also where you're going to look at certain things like shifting left your testing capabilities, where you're going to think about, okay, how can we make sure we test more in the unit and system tests, where we're using service virtualization. And at the end, we want to make sure we optimize the whole thing by building that build, measure, learn methodology. Now, that combined, that brings us to the ACT framework. That's the full framework. We have a stand in the partner area, theactframework.com. We have a website, www.theactframework.com. If you sign up there, you will be able to download a white paper that basically describes the whole model in about 10 pages. And we're constantly developing this, right? We're constantly developing this, and the idea is that behind each of these icons, there will be content, there will be blog posts, there will be videos that explain the concepts. There will even be training and a certification program for each of these different roles, and to basically implement this in your organization. And then my last ask: if you are interested in this and you want to become an early adopter, whether that be as a partner or as a customer, please reach out to us as well. Come by our booth. Send us an email at act@theactframework.com. Provide us feedback on what you think of the model and if you think this is going in the right direction, what is missing, what is great, and that would be great. And then together we can make this the de facto standard and really have something for testing in the enterprise. Thank you so much.